He rejected her before the court. Then the rival Alpha King took her hand before the entire kingdom. The moon hung low over the castle of Eldoria, casting silver light over the spires and stone walls. In the great hall, torchlight flickered, throwing shadows across faces filled with curiosity, anticipation, and a touch of dread. Tonight, the royal court gathered not only for the usual councils of power, but for a spectacle whispered in hushed tones across the kingdom. The arrival of Lady Selene, the mysterious noblewoman whose family had fallen from grace, carrying rumors of both power and disgrace. Selene entered the hall with quiet dignity, her cloak of midnight blue trailing behind her. She was young, but her eyes, dark, intense, and watchful, betrayed both intelligence and sorrow. She moved with careful steps, aware that every gaze followed her. Some eyes measured her beauty, others measured her weakness. Some even lingered on her bloodline, whispered to be touched by an old curse that made her both feared and unwanted. At the center of the hall, King Eric, the Alpha of Eldoria, sat on his throne. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hair like spun gold and eyes that could chill a man's soul with a single glance. To the court, he was perfection, strong, unyielding, and untouchable. But to Selene, he was a symbol of everything she had lost: the power she could never claim, the family that had betrayed her, the cruel world that seemed determined to crush those born without privilege. The hall fell into silence as Selene approached. Her heart pounded, but she kept her chin high. This was her moment, not to beg, not to plead, but to show she existed, even if the world refused to honor her. King Eric's gaze settled on her, sharp and assessing. A hush fell across the room. "Lady Selene," Eric's voice was smooth and commanding, echoing through the hall. "You seek sanctuary in my court, yet your family's disgrace precedes you. Tell me, why should I permit your presence here?" Selene lifted her voice, steady despite the tremor in her chest. "My family has wronged many, your majesty. I do not ask for honor nor for power. I only seek shelter for myself until I may find a place worthy of my blood. I offer loyalty in return for protection." The court murmured. Whispers of doubt, fear, and scandal spread like wildfire. Some sneered at her audacity. Others seemed uncertain, as if waiting for the king's judgment to anchor their own opinions. Eric's eyes narrowed. His lips curved into a faint, cruel smile. "Loyalty? To whom? To your cursed bloodline. Your words are empty and your presence unwelcome." He raised a hand, silencing the court entirely. "Leave. You shall not darken my hall with your shadow." Selene felt her chest tighten. Her throat burned, but she forced herself to breathe. The rejection was worse than she had imagined, not just a denial, but a spectacle for the court to witness. Humiliation cut deeper than hunger or cold. Yet beneath the sting, a spark of defiance stirred. She did not move immediately. Her gaze met Eric's, steady and unwavering. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Her hands clenched at her sides, nails pressing into her palms. This rejection, she decided, would not define her. Not now, not ever. Before she could bow and retreat, the hall doors burst open with a gust. The cold wind whipped across the jagged peaks of the Darkspire Mountains, carrying the scent of pine, rain, and distant danger. Far from the gilded halls of Eldoria, Lady Selene now rode beside Alpha Kale, the enigmatic ruler of the rival kingdom of Verath. His fortress loomed ahead, a fortress carved into the mountains themselves, half hidden by shadows and mist. The walls were black stone, crowned with spikes and banners that fluttered like silent warnings. Selene's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of fear and anticipation. She could still feel the echo of Eldoria's great hall, the sting of King Eric's rejection, the cold judgment in every whisper, the court's collective gasp when Kale had stepped forward and taken her hand. That moment had changed everything, and yet nothing was certain. She was a guest, and perhaps a prisoner in a world she barely understood. Kale rode beside her, silent as always. His presence was commanding, even when he did not speak. His dark hair fell over his eyes, which seemed to pierce through the shadows themselves, and his jaw was set in a way that suggested both strength and restraint. Unlike Eric, Kale did not need words to assert control. The air around him carried it naturally. Selene could feel the weight of his gaze, not as judgment, but as an unreadable, quiet force that demanded attention. "Your people, they must have wondered," Selene said carefully, breaking the silence, "about why you claimed me before the court." Kale's eyes did not meet hers at first. He stared at the path ahead, the mountains casting long shadows in the moonlight. "I do not act for the approval of others," he said finally, his voice low like distant thunder. "I act for what is necessary." Selene nodded, unsure whether his words were meant to comfort her or warn her. She had survived ridicule, rejection, and whispers of curses. Yet there was something in Kale's manner that stirred an unfamiliar feeling, something between safety and danger, trust and hesitation. The fortress gates opened before them, enormous doors sliding apart as though moved by invisible hands. Inside, the halls were dimly lit, with flickering sconces casting long shadows along the walls. Servants moved silently, bows lowered but attentive, while soldiers in dark armor stood at intervals, eyes sharp and disciplined. The air smelled of stone, candle wax, and a faint, earthy scent of magic that made Selene's skin tingle. Kale led her to a chamber overlooking the mountains. The windows were vast, stretching from floor to ceiling, revealing a world of jagged peaks and mist-choked valleys. The moonlight spilled across the room, silver and cold, illuminating her reflection in the polished stone floor. "You will stay here," Kale said, motioning to the room. "For now, you are under my protection." Selene took a slow breath. "Protection or control?" she asked softly, her voice careful but tinged with curiosity. Kale's gaze finally met hers. There was no smile, no malice, only a steady, unflinching certainty. "Perhaps both, but you will learn that control is often necessary to survive in this world." Selene's mind raced. She had heard tales of Kale, his ruthlessness, his cunning, and the darkness that surrounded his kingdom. And yet in that room she sensed that beneath the shadow lay a man who was more than the whispers claimed. A man shaped by pain, honor, and secrets he did not reveal easily. Over the following days, Selene explored the fortress under Kale's watchful eye. She saw libraries filled with ancient tomes, halls that whispered of battles long past, and chambers where magic seemed to hum faintly in the air. She met the council of Kale's advisors, men and women whose loyalty bordered on devotion, who regarded her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Despite the grandeur, Selene felt a strange loneliness. She was far from home, far from everything familiar, and yet she could not ignore the pull of this strange new world. Kale did not demand her loyalty. He expected it to be earned through observation, courage, and respect. And for the first time, Selene began to understand that power was not always inherited. It could be seized, shaped, and mastered. But peace was fragile. Rumors reached the fortress of Eldoria's court, of Eric's fury at her disappearance and the shame it brought him. He had sent spies and messengers, some claiming that Selene's presence in Veyrath could spark war. Others suggested more subtle threats, alliances to be broken, magical curses to be awakened, or whispers to turn the hearts of those she sought to protect. One evening, Selene stood at the edge of the fortress, looking down at the valleys below. The wind carried the scent of rain and stone, and the distant howl of a creature stirred unease in her chest. Kale joined her silently, his cloak sweeping behind him like a shadow of night. "They are watching," he said, eyes fixed on the distance. "Eldoria will not accept what has happened quietly." Selene shivered, partly from the wind, partly from the weight of his words. "I never asked for this," she admitted, her voice barely above the sound of the wind. "I only sought shelter, not a place in a struggle between kings." Kale's gaze softened, though his posture remained rigid. "You did not ask, yet fate often does not seek permission. The words hung between them like a spell. Selene felt the truth in them, a weight she could neither push away nor ignore. She was a pawn, perhaps, in the eyes of kings, but she was also becoming something else, something capable of shaping her own destiny. That night, Selene dreamt of Eldoria. She saw Eric's face, cold and unforgiving, framed by the grand halls that had once rejected her. She saw whispers turning into shadows, spreading like smoke, threatening to choke her with doubt and fear. But beneath it she felt a pulse, her own heartbeat, steady and defiant, reminding her that she was not powerless. When she awoke, Cale was standing at the window, looking at the first light of dawn creeping across the mountains. "You cannot change the past," he said quietly without turning to her, "but you can shape what comes next." Selene met his eyes, searching for something, hope, trust, perhaps even understanding. She saw a flicker of something human in the darkness around him, a hint that Cale was more than the tales of fear and cruelty suggested. Days passed, and Selene began training with Cale's warriors, not as a fighter, but as a student of strategy, history, and the subtle arts of influence and survival. She learned to read the subtle signs of power, to listen to whispers of the wind and the land, and to control the small sparks of magic that stirred in her veins. Cale watched her, often silently, sometimes offering a word of advice or correction. His presence was a constant reminder that she was both protected and challenged, nurtured and tested. She began to understand that trust, like power, was not given freely. It had to be earned through courage, resilience, and the willingness to face one's own fears. Yet even in the safety of Veyrath, danger was never far. One night, a shadow moved through the outer walls of the fortress, creature or curse. Selene could not tell. She felt it before she saw it, a pulse in the air that pricked her skin and tightened her chest. Cale appeared beside her, silent and deadly, his presence a shield. Together, they confronted the shadow, and for the first time, Selene felt the raw thrill of standing beside someone whose strength both terrified and reassured her. The shadow fled, but it left a mark, a whisper of the dark forces that lurked beyond kingdoms, forces drawn to her blood, her lineage, and the power that she had yet to fully understand. Cale turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "The world will not allow you peace," he said. "You will be tested over and over, but if you survive, you will be stronger than any king, any kingdom, any curse that seeks to claim you." Selene nodded, determination rising within her like the first light of dawn over the mountains. She no longer feared rejection, nor whispers, nor the judgment of kings. She would survive, she would learn, and she would choose her own path, even if it meant walking it beside a man as dark and enigmatic as Cale. But the thought of Eldoria never left her. Eric's rejection, the humiliation before the court, and the fire of unspoken emotions lingered in her mind. She could not help but wonder, what would he do next? Would he strike, scheming from the shadows, or would he watch, powerless, as she rose beyond everything he had ever claimed? The answer would come soon enough. And when it did, Selene knew she had to be ready, not just to face Eric, but to face herself. The cursed forest stretched beyond the fortress walls of Veyrath, dark and tangled, where mist clung to the ground like living shadows. Lady Selene walked its paths with careful steps, her cloak brushing damp leaves, her senses alert. Even in the safety of Cale's domain, the world felt alive with whispers, whispers of danger, of power, and of the burden she carried. Each step reminded her that she was no longer just a guest or a survivor. She was a player in a game that spanned kingdoms, curses, and hearts. Cale followed silently behind her, his presence always near, always felt. He said little these days, but his eyes, dark as the forest itself, watched her every move. There was a tension between them, unspoken yet potent, a mix of respect, curiosity, and something neither dared to name aloud. Selene often felt her pulse quicken in his gaze, though she could never tell if it was fear, admiration, or something deeper stirring within her. "Why do you bring me here?" she asked finally, breaking the silence as they paused by an ancient oak, its bark carved with runes older than memory. Kale's gaze scanned the forest, cautious. "The forest tests those who enter it," he said. "You must learn to face what lurks in shadow before it finds you unprepared." Selene frowned. "Tests? I have faced more than enough already: rejection, betrayal, fear. What more could this forest possibly demand of me?" Kale's lips pressed into a line, a shadow of a smile tugging at the corner. "Courage, control, patience, things you may not yet fully understand." They walked deeper, the air thickening with magic. Selene could feel it in the hairs of her arms, a tingling pulse that made her heart race. Whispers floated through the trees, soft and urgent, warning her to step carefully. Somewhere in the distance, a creature stirred, a shadow of claws and teeth, drawn to the remnants of the curse in her bloodline. She shivered, and Kale's hand brushed against hers, steadying her. "You are stronger than you think," he said quietly, his voice barely above the murmur of the wind. "Do not doubt yourself, even when the world does." Selene met his eyes, searching for reassurance, and for the first time she sensed that his words were not just instruction, they were belief. Something deep within Kale had stirred, a recognition that she was not just a pawn or a prize, but a force in her own right. Days turned into weeks as Selene trained with Kale's warriors and explored the fortress's secrets. She learned to read the subtle movements of power, to sense danger before it struck, and to wield the small sparks of magic that had always lived in her veins. Kale guided her with patience, pushing her to master control but never forcing her beyond her limits. He allowed her to grow at her own pace, a silent witness to her transformation. Yet the past refused to stay buried. Rumors from Eldoria reached her even here. Spies disguised as traders and travelers slipped notes and messages under doors, warning her of Eric's schemes. He had not forgotten, nor forgiven. The whispers told of alliances being formed, of magical enchantments and plots meant to reclaim or punish her. Selene knew that one day she would have to face him, not as a frightened girl, but as someone who had claimed her own power. One evening, Kale led her to the library, a vast hall filled with towering shelves of ancient texts and scrolls. The air smelled of parchment, candle wax, and something faintly metallic, like blood long forgotten. Selene's fingers brushed over the spines, tracing the names of battles, kings, and heroes long dead. "Knowledge is power," Kale said, standing beside her. "But wisdom comes from understanding it, not just possessing it." Selene nodded, absorbing every word. She realized that she was learning more than magic or strategy. She was learning herself. Her fears, her anger, her longing, they were all tools now, shaping her into someone who could act, who could decide, who could no longer be dismissed. But even as she grew stronger, Kale remained an enigma. Moments of warmth, soft words, a guiding hand, a shared glance, were balanced by his shadows, the distance in his expression, and the cold weight of responsibility he carried. Selene wanted to understand him, to break through the walls he had built around his heart. And yet she feared that doing so would bring pain as much as comfort. Their connection deepened slowly, in small, almost imperceptible ways. A shared silence in the training yard, a hand lingering on hers when danger approached. A glance that spoke volumes in a world that rarely allowed vulnerability. Selene began to see that trust, like love, was built on shared trials and quiet courage. But it also came with chains, chains of expectation, duty, and the fear of loss. One night the castle was quiet except for the crackle of fire in the great hall. Selene sat across from Kale, a map of Eldoria spread before them. Candles cast flickering shadows, painting both their faces in warm gold. "The spies report movements in the valleys," Kale said, his finger tracing paths through forests and mountains. "Eric's forces are preparing. He will act soon." Selene's heart tightened. She had imagined this confrontation countless times, him standing before her, the cold pride she had once feared, and now the question, would she bow, flee, or rise? "I will not run," she said, her voice steady. "I have learned too much, seen too much to be afraid of him now. If he wishes to test me, I will meet him on my own terms." Kale's eyes softened, and for a moment the walls around him seemed to falter. "Good," he said, "but remember this, you do not face the world alone." The night stretched on, heavy with tension and unspoken words. Selene felt the weight of her choices pressing against her chest, the pull of Eldoria's shadow across the mountains, and the strange, growing warmth of Kale's presence at her side. She realized that strength was not just about magic or skill. It was about standing firm in the face of fear, about trusting in herself and those who chose to stand with her. The next day, Selene ventured into the outer walls of the fortress, drawn by the need to test herself. She moved through the forest, careful but fearless, feeling the pulse of magic in the earth beneath her feet. Birds and beasts stirred, sensing the change in her. Shadows shifted, whispers followed, and the air grew thick with anticipation. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist, a creature of the cursed forest, drawn by her blood, its eyes glowing with unnatural hunger. Selene froze, but Kale was there in an instant, a shadow of motion and power, his blade cutting through the mist like lightning. Together they faced the creature, moving in perfect synchrony, their trust and understanding palpable. Selene felt fear, yes, but also exhilaration. She realized that this partnership, this bond with Kale, was not just protection, it was empowerment. She had learned to control her own magic, to stand firm, and to trust her instincts. She was no longer the frightened girl Eric had dismissed. She was a force he could no longer ignore. When the creature finally retreated, Kale's hand found hers again. This time there was no hesitation, no unspoken warning, only connection, quiet and undeniable. Selene felt a shiver run through her, a mix of fear, longing, and something else she could not yet name. "You are ready," Kale said quietly. "But readiness is not just about power. It is about choice, and soon you will have to make one." Selene nodded, understanding the truth in his words. Eric's shadow loomed closer, and the time would come when she would have to confront him, not as the girl who had begged for mercy, but as someone who had claimed her destiny. That night, she dreamed again of Eldoria. She saw Eric standing on the balcony of his castle, eyes blazing with pride and fury, the court behind him a sea of judgment. She saw herself walking toward him, not as a beggar, not as a pawn, but as a woman who had grown beyond his rejection. And yet in the dream, a shadow moved between them, a shadow that whispered of danger, deceit, and choices that could change everything. Selene woke with a start, her heart racing. Kale was already awake, watching her with quiet intensity. "You cannot ignore what comes," he said. "The choice is yours, but the consequences will follow." She rose, feeling the weight of destiny pressing upon her. She no longer feared rejection, humiliation, or the judgment of kings. She had her power, her courage, and the strange, unspoken bond with Kale that strengthened her resolve. But the path ahead was uncertain, and the shadows of both kingdoms pressed close. Outside, the wind carried whispers from Eldoria and the cursed forest alike. Selene clenched her fists, her mind sharp and her heart steady. She was ready to face what came next, not as a victim, not as a pawn, but as herself. And when the time came, she would choose her destiny, and no king, curse, or shadow would claim it for her. The sun rose blood-red over Eldoria, painting the castle walls in shades of fire and shadow. Lady Selene stood at the edge of Verath's fortress, her cloak whipping in the wind, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon where Eldoria's towers rose like a crown of stone. She had trained, grown, and mastered her power, but today was the day she would confront the past, the man who had rejected her, and the consequences of that rejection. Kale stood beside her, silent and steady, his dark eyes tracing the path she would walk. Though he said little, his presence was a shield and a reassurance, a reminder that she was not alone. Selene drew a deep breath. Fear, anticipation, and determination mingled in her chest, each heartbeat like a drum of war. She was ready. "We leave at dawn," Kale said quietly. "And remember, you are more than they believe you to be, more than they fear. Trust in yourself." Selene nodded, feeling a fire ignite within her. She had learned that strength was not measured in fear or fury, but in the courage to face what must be faced, and in the wisdom to wield her power with care. She was no longer the girl who had knelt before Eldoria's court, trembling under Eric's judgment. She was a force, a woman who had claimed her destiny. The journey to Eldoria was tense but silent. The mountains gave way to forests and valleys, each step echoing with the weight of the coming confrontation. Selene felt the pulse of the land beneath her, the subtle magic in the air that whispered of challenge, of risk, of destiny. Kale rode beside her, his hand occasionally brushing hers, a silent tether that anchored her courage. At the gates of Eldoria, the court waited. Torches burned along the walls, casting long shadows. Soldiers stood rigid, eyes trained on the pair approaching. And at the center of it all, King Eric stood, tall and proud, his golden hair catching the sunlight. His gaze landed on Selene the moment she appeared, and she felt the same cold, sharp edge of judgment she had once known. But now it was tempered by surprise, uncertainty, and perhaps even admiration. "Lady Selene," Eric said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "You return alone under the shadow of another king. Tell me, do you come to beg or to boast?" Selene stepped forward, her head held high. "Neither," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I come to stand for myself." A hush fell over the courtyard. Courtiers whispered, soldiers shifted, and Eric's eyes narrowed, searching for some sign of weakness. He found none. Selene was calm, her presence radiating confidence and authority. Kale stepped forward beside her, not to dominate or threaten but to show unity. Together they were a statement of strength and resolve. Eric's gaze flicked between them, conflicted. Pride, anger, and something unspoken warred across his face. "You dare return here," Eric said, voice low, dangerous. "After the shame, the humiliation, do you think you can claim a place in my kingdom?" Selene met his gaze without flinching. "I do not seek a place in your kingdom, Eric. I seek only to claim my own. I will not kneel to fear nor to pride. I will not be bound by your judgment." The tension in the air was electric, as if the world itself held its breath. Then, a sudden ripple of magic swept across the courtyard, whispers of the cursed forest that had followed her, the power she had mastered, the authority she now wielded. Soldiers took cautious steps back, courtiers gasped, and Eric stiffened, sensing the force he had once dismissed. Kale's hand rested lightly on hers. "Your power, Selene, is yours alone," he said quietly. "Do not let doubt cloud it." Selene drew a slow, steadying breath, feeling the warmth of his presence, the strength of her own conviction. She lifted her hand, calling forth the magic she had nurtured in Veyrath, the subtle pulses of light, the echoes of the forest, the quiet force that now answered to her will. It shimmered around her, not as a weapon but as a declaration. She was no longer afraid. She was no longer a victim. Eric's gaze faltered. The pride that had once blinded him now wavered. He saw the woman he had rejected, not as a shadow of shame, but as a force of courage and wisdom. And though he could not admit it, admiration and perhaps regret touched the edge of his heart. "You have changed," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, almost human. "Stronger than I imagined, and yet," he faltered, struggling with the words he could not speak. Selene's eyes softened, not with forgiveness but with understanding. "I have learned," she said. "I have grown, but it is not your approval I seek." Kale stepped closer, his presence steady and unwavering. "And I will not ask it," he said. "Your path is your own, Selene. But know this, we stand together, no matter what comes." The courtyard seemed to pulse with expectation. Eric's pride fought against the truth in front of him. Selene's magic shimmered softly around her, a quiet power that spoke louder than any words. And Kale's eyes, dark and unreadable, held a depth of feeling that Selene now understood. The bond they shared was not fear or obligation, but choice, trust, and respect. For a moment, silence held the world. Then Eric stepped back, his hands clenching at his sides. "If you choose this path," he said, voice tight with emotion, "know that it will not be without consequence. The court, the kingdom, they will judge you." Selene nodded. "I am ready." Then the first movement of battle stirred. From the shadows of the outer walls, agents of Eldoria, disguised as traders, spies, and soldiers, emerged, testing her power, testing Kale's strength, testing the bond that had grown between them. The courtyard became a place of quiet struggle, where Selene moved with calm precision, her magic guiding her steps, her instincts sharp. Kale's movements mirrored hers, fluid and protective, a dance of trust and skill that left the attackers off balance. When the dust settled, Selene stood tall, her cloak dusted with the remnants of the skirmish, her eyes shining with clarity and resolve. Kale remained at her side, unyielding, his hand brushing hers in silent support. And for the first time, Eldoria saw her as she truly was, not a fragile noblewoman, not a shadow of shame, but a force of courage and conviction. Eric's gaze met hers again, longer this time. The fire in his eyes had not vanished, but it had softened, tempered by recognition. He had seen her strength, her mastery, her courage. And though he had once rejected her, he now understood that some bonds could not be denied, some choices could not be undone. "You have earned your place," Eric said at last, voice quieter, tinged with respect he had never shown before. "Not in my court, perhaps, but in the world, and I see it now." Selene nodded, her own heart heavy with understanding. She did not seek his approval, but she accepted the acknowledgement. Redemption, she realized, was not about forgiveness from others. It was about claiming one's own truth, standing unbroken, and embracing the power to shape one's destiny. Kale stepped closer, his hand finally enclosing hers fully. "You choose your path," he said, "and I choose to walk it with you." Selene felt a warmth unlike any she had known, a quiet certainty that this was more than protection or power. It was partnership, trust, and the promise of shared courage. Together they would face the shadows, the curses, and the trials that awaited, knowing that strength and love could coexist, even in the darkest of times. The court watched in awe, the air thick with tension and wonder. Eldoria had witnessed a woman rise from rejection to mastery, from fear to courage, from humiliation to legend. Kale's presence beside her was a statement, not of domination, but of loyalty, respect, and choice, the truest form of power. Selene turned her gaze one final time toward Eldoria's towers, feeling the weight of her past lift. She had been rejected, tested, and challenged, but she had emerged whole, unbroken, and ready for the future she would claim. And as she looked at Kale, the shadows of the past melted into the promise of tomorrow. Together, they would forge a legacy stronger than any kingdom, deeper than any curse, and brighter than any doubt. The sun climbed higher, painting the horizon in gold and silver, and for the first time, Selene felt a quiet peace. The chains of the heart had been broken, the lessons learned, the choices made. The story of Lady Selene, the woman who had been rejected, tested, and redeemed, was only just beginning.